Hello, everybody. Welcome to another episode of the Range Gareth podcast. I'm your host, Gareth, and I am joined today by my friend, University of Alberta professor of biological sciences, urban wildlife researcher, and I would say one of the leading coyote experts for Western Canada, Colleen Cassady St Clair. Hi, Colleen. How are you doing?
Good, Gareth. Thanks for having me today.
I've wanted to do this for a while. I've known you for probably 4 years now.
Yeah.
Probably around that long.
Yeah, at least that.
And we've been working together on a lot of coyote projects within Edmonton. My role did recently switch, but if it wasn't for you, a lot of the city's coyote projects wouldn't have gotten off the ground in regards to some of the hazing techniques we've been using, some of the collaborative approaches we've been using between the city and the university and some private contractors. So thanks for all your assistance in that matter.
Oh, well, you're welcome. And thanks in turn to the city and all the people we work with.
Just to introduce you to people, while I was looking up your background for the episode, you have studied in 3 countries already.
Yeah, that's true.
Started off at the University of Alberta, where you got your Bachelor of Science. Then over to New Zealand to get your Master of Science with distinction. And then got your PhD in Oklahoma. You know what? I didn't think this was how I was going to start the podcast, but what is it like learning in 3 different countries? Is it is the culture of education noticeably different? The students, like the student body, noticeably different?
Yeah, it is. I think that would be true within Canada, but among countries, maybe even a little more so. I'm a big advocate of traveling if one can, for any reason, for any length of time and anywhere. But I think it's really a privilege to travel and go to school at the same time, because then you get to live as local people live. You make friends with local people, and you have this experience of living in another culture, and it's wonderful. You discover how many things you think are, kind of the same everywhere that actually are not.
So how would local life in Christchurch, New Zealand be compared to Edmonton?
Well, it's a lot warmer in the winter.
That would be nice.
In fact, one of the cultural differences that I noticed right away is it's quite English, and boys are not allowed to wear, first of all, everybody wears a uniform to school, and boys are not allowed to wear long pants until they're in 6th grade, the start of adolescence. So before that, they have to wear short pants, even when it's like below 0 outside and sort of sleeting or raining and howling winds. It's just, part of their stiff upper lip inheritance, I guess.
Yeah.
So that's just one little example of a cultural thing. You wouldn't find Canadian kids doing that, I think.
Oh, I love the English. It's one of those things, I don't know if it's like a source of pride, but almost every winter I will still see a couple people in Edmonton rocking the shorts when it's, minus 15, minus 20. And I'm like, what is going through your head?
Yeah.
But they just seem impervious to it.
Yeah, or maybe they're doing the stoic thing where they're like purposely making themselves really uncomfortable so that when they go back indoors, they just feel that extra gratitude.
I've definitely been guilty of doing that. Where I'm like, oh yeah, I'm starting to lose feeling in my thighs, but it is going to feel so great when I get home.
Yeah.
Also, when I was looking up some of your stuff, something that we both were discussing right before the show started, you have been a published researcher for around as long as I've been alive. Since 1990, you have been involved in wildlife research. We have predation of eggs in crested penguins, maternal infanticide in royal penguins. A lot of penguin work, actually.
Yeah, well, let me explain how that came about. As you mentioned, I did my undergraduate degree here at the University of Alberta, and I had a couple of projects in 3rd and 4th year. They were quite open-ended. You could write a paper on whatever you wanted or do a presentation or whatever. And I got kind of interested in penguins then. No real reason. I noticed the same thing in undergrads today. And then I thought, wouldn't it be fun to go volunteer on a penguin research project? So as I finished my undergraduate degree, I wrote some letters to people that had published papers about penguins and offered my services as a volunteer. I claim to be easy to get along with and not to eat very much, to be a hard worker.
Yeah.
And one of my letters ended up being given to the former PhD student of my undergraduate advisor, who had written a letter of recommendation for this purpose. So on the strength of that letter, a professor in New Zealand wrote to me and said, hey, I don't have a project going on right now that you could volunteer on, but I do have some funding and you could come and do your own project, your own master's degree on this. What do you think? So that was an amazing, that was an amazing stroke of luck. And Ian McLean is his name. And so off I went to New Zealand and went off to this little island off the west coast of New Zealand at the northern tip of Fiordland on the South Island of New Zealand, where this penguin called the Fiordland crested penguin lives, and studied them.
I am going to throw a picture of this penguin onto the YouTube video supplement for this because I am so curious. I thought I knew my penguins okay. Oh!
Cute, eh?
Okay. I feel like I've seen... this looks so familiar.
Well, they're one of 6 species of crested penguins. All of those penguins live in kind of subantarctic islands. None of them live on the Antarctic continent. They all look kind of alike. They're called crested penguins because they have these yellow sort of sulfury crest feathers coming out of each side of their head, which are kind of a signal, probably a signal of quality. Both sexes have these feathers, so it's sort of believed that they have mutual sexual selection. And when they're courting each other, they sort of turn their head from side to side as if giving their prospective mate the opportunity to see like how beautiful those feathers are, how yellow, how perfectly symmetrical, or whatever.
Check out the goods. My feathers are so glossy.
Yeah. Well, the cool thing about the Fiordland penguins is they're the only one of these species that nests in caves.
Oh.
So this island that I worked on, called Open Bay, or Tamaka is the Maori name for it, is it's made of limestone and it's riddled with caves. So some of the work consisted of, for example, sort of slithering downhill on my belly into a cave and then, becoming courageous enough to reach out and grab a penguin by the neck.
Oh my goodness.
And then drag it out of the cave, slithering uphill backwards on my belly. I was not very good at that, actually.
Were you roped in at all? Or?
Well, no, they weren't dangerous caves. They were just kind of, they were a bit smelly and not surprisingly full of penguin poop. But that's when I later, for my PhD, I also worked on penguins on different islands and didn't have to slither around in caves, and I liked that better for sure. But these Fiordland crested penguins are one of the lesser known species of crested penguins. They're quite hard to study. Like all the crested penguins, they lay 2 eggs, but they never raise 2 chicks to fledging. So that phenomenon is known as brood reduction, and these penguins are among there's about 10 families of birds in the world that have what's called obligate brood reduction. They always lay more eggs than they raise to be chicks. So that's what I was studying. I was trying to figure out like an evolutionary puzzle. Why do they do this? How is this, beneficial for their fitness? And how exactly is this second chick, or sometimes as an egg, how is it lost? Those are the questions I focused on.
So that makes me think of something that I learned back when I was learning my biology, and maybe it's changed now. Do they still believe in the whole R-selected versus K-selected species? Is that still kind of a...
Yeah. Those terms have become a little bit dated. I still find them useful, and I still use them. But the more current terms would be a fast versus slow life history. So penguins are extremely slow in their life history, very, very K-selected, meaning they have these kinds of traits. They take a long time to reach sexual maturity, even longer to breed successfully. They have small clutch sizes. their offspring require a lot of care. They require care from both parents. These penguins forage offshore, so they swim quite a ways to their food sources, and they couldn't possibly raise even one chick without both parents participating. So they have quite slow reproduction. They don't produce many chicks that survive to fledge in their lifetime, and they reach maturity very slowly. There was an Australian researcher that showed that they don't typically start breeding until they're about 7 years old, even though they're sexually mature by the time they're sort of 3 or 4. So kind of like humans, we go through adolescence at a much earlier age than we typically start producing kids.
Yeah.
And this guy, Robert Carrick was his name, discovered that they didn't all enter the breeding population until they were 11. 11 years old.
Oh, wow.
They probably lived to be, maximum lifespans of mid-20s or so. So sort of like albatrosses, quite similar life history to albatrosses, and really slow to grow up. That kind of gives me sort of heartening for my own kids, late bloomers.
Yeah. Do albatrosses also do the obligate brood reduction?
No, they go a step further and they only lay one egg. So the really interesting thing about these crested penguins is they lay 2 eggs, but it seems they're only able to raise 3 of the species are only able to even incubate one of the eggs. One of the eggs just disappears. The first laid egg disappears from the nest a few days after laying.
Oh.
So the thinking is, this isn't entirely my own, but I guess I added to it. Over evolutionary time, it's believed that they went from being an inshore foraging species that could make many trips to their breeding grounds to an offshore foraging species, and they just didn't have time to bring enough food back to feed 2 chicks. So this behavior that I discovered later in royal penguins, where the parents, usually the female, actually kicks her own first laid egg out of the nest, usually within 24 hours of laying her second egg. So it's almost as if she can feel that egg in her oviduct. Like, I'm not a bird, but I imagine something that's 5% of your body weight. You feel that thing moving.
Yeah.
And when she's certain she's about to lay another egg, she just gets rid of the first one, which otherwise might serve some kind of insurance function. Because I did find a few penguin pairs that only laid 1 egg, and I think they were probably young birds. So maybe they keep this first laid egg until the second one is kind of on its way, and then they turf it so that they can incubate 1 egg more successfully, like albatrosses do.
Yeah. So you mentioned that the penguin's egg could be 5% of its body weight. You also spent time in New Zealand. You can probably kind of think where I'm going with this, but the kiwi, that bird, you know what? I'm going to have to pull up that picture as well. I saw a picture, it was an x-ray of a kiwi with an egg in its body. And the egg made up something like, it looked like 70% of the bird's internal, no, not 70%, but
I think it's more like 30, but yeah, they do lay the largest eggs relative to body size.
That is absurd.
Any bird. Yeah.
Where do the rest of its organs go? Like, I'm going to put this one online, but for anyone that's wondering, picture if someone took an x-ray of your body and where your stomach and all of your intestines are.
That's an incredible picture.
That is. I really hope it's a real picture and I'm not just getting fooled.
Well, think of your favorite meal that you've vastly overeaten and that very uncomfortable kind of distended abdomen feeling you get. I imagine it's a bit like that. Like all internal organs just get sort of pushed aside.
This is unreal. Man, nature is so crazy. I look at this picture and I don't know what the evolutionary value is. Like with an egg that big, do their chicks come out ready to go? Like up and running within minutes?
They do. I can't quite remember. You're catching me with some unexpected questions, but I think kiwi chicks are among what's known as precocial, meaning they do hatch from the egg in quite a developed state compared to, say, robin chicks. Are a robin might lay 4 to 6 eggs, and when those chicks hatch, they're really altricial. They're featherless and helpless, and they have to be fed by the parents for quite a long time before they can do anything. And that's another thing that's kind of interesting about the different life history strategies. So waterfowl also have very precocial young, and it's thought to be because they nest in places where the parents can't really effectively protect them for very long, and they need to be able to swim really quickly to escape predators. So they're quite precocial too, and everybody's seen goslings that look like little fluff balls that are still able, amazingly, to swim.
I haven't had any luck with it yet, but I do have a fishing lure that looks like a duckling, because apparently at certain times of year the pike will go crazy for that. And that just tying it back into the birds, like they always need to be ready for that, because when a lot of people think of predation on birds, they forget about fish.
Yeah.
And pike will eat anything. I don't know. Have you fished much?
A little bit, yeah.
But in Alberta, some people view pike as a trash fish because it's stinky and covered in ridiculously thick slime, and it does taste kind of fishy, and it is more difficult to get the fillets off this fish because it has a Y bone that branches off from the spine and makes the filleting process more difficult. But I love them because they will bite anything. If I put down something stinky, I'm going to catch a pike. If I put down something flashy, it'll get a pike. If I put down something that rattles in the water, it'll get a pike.
Wow.
Duckling lures, frog lures that sit on top of the water. I haven't had any luck with it yet, but I've seen videos of pike just smashing these frog lures, these duckling lures, even mice lures. And being in New Zealand, just as a guy who watches as many fishing videos as I can, I've seen videos of fly fishermen using flies that look like mice and catching big brown trout in New Zealand. Wow. Because brown trout have been introduced from Europe all over the place. For better or for worse, depending on what your views are on the ecology versus sportsman debate. But New Zealand, some of the reservoirs down there just have amazingly big trout. Yeah. I've seen 20, 30 pound rainbow trout and brown trout getting pulled out of the reservoirs there. Yeah. And they do go after bigger things, because once you're, 30 pounds, eating bugs all day, at least I assume, is not going to be as satisfying as eating a couple mice. Yeah. And that makes me think of this other thing. Do you use Instagram much? No. There's this page called Nature is Metal, and it's just like metal, like a death metal, like super hardcore. And it is all just crazy animal attack videos and just things you wouldn't expect. And a lot of animals that were previously thought of as herbivores have been shown to be, what's the term? It's not obligate carnivore, but like an opportunistic carnivore. Yeah, like omnivores. Yeah, there will be elk. I saw a video of an elk that ate a goose. Wow. That's amazing to me. Yeah, it was a young, it might have been a gosling, like a juvenile one, but this elk chased it down and then just ate it while the tourists were all screaming oh my God! Because when you see an animal that you think is 100% vegetarian and then suddenly it's eating a gosling, that's why am I forgetting the term? Throws in a bit of cognitive dissonance. What you're seeing does not match what you're thinking at all. Yeah. Well, ground squirrels are like that too. Everybody thinks of those guys as being completely herbivorous. They're so cute. Grass seeds and stuff, but they are kind of notorious for eating other ground squirrels if they get the chance. So sometimes people report seeing, say, Richardson's ground squirrels on the side of the road eating the Richardson's ground squirrel that was just hit by a car. Oh. And I'm not sure really why this is quite widespread, but I'd speculate it's because most animals are quite protein limited. That's why things like geese and ground squirrels are attracted to mowed, fertilized lawns, because that treatment of lawns is really stimulating the new growth of very young grass at constant rate of turnover, and it's much higher in nitrogen and protein. Oh, so I never think of grass as a source of protein, but I guess, they have to get it from somewhere. Yeah. Yeah, well, think of, the craze for eating quinoa is because of that. It's a grass that's very high in protein. Yeah. So, you can build up your muscles eating frogs or
fresh grass.
Yeah. Would you rather eat one frog or 5 pounds of grass? I know what I'm choosing personally, but my wife, she wanted me to like go a day without eating meat because I'm a very I love meat. I eat a lot of it. I know some people have different views on whether that's good for the environment or not. I think it is if the farmers are responsible with the way they run their operation, and not every farm is going to be carbon positive or carbon negative. But so she decided to give me a lentil soup.
Oh, nice.
My body did not agree with lentils.
Oh, well, you just have to like take it slowly and teach your microbiome to like lentils.
Maybe if I slowly introduced myself, it would have worked, but just that bowl of lentils, as someone who, you know, is used to eating like high fat, high protein meats, like it gets into your muscles really quickly. This bowl of lentils, I don't think I ate for 2 days afterwards because it was just like I didn't feel queasy. It was just it sat so heavy.
Yeah.
And my stomach was just struggling to digest these lentils. It was making like it sounded like whale songs. Like I'm laying there and we're trying to watch a show and I'm like, oh God. I'm sorry, sweetheart. This is going to happen for a while now.
Yeah, just think of how distressed those poor microbes were in your gut. They're like, we never get fiber. We never get to eat fiber. Look at all this fiber. What will we do?
They did not know what to do.
You know, that's actually kind of a good segue, if you want, to one of the coolest things we've learned about coyotes.
Yes.
Yeah? Shall I keep going about microbiome and coyotes?
You know, that is one of the big reasons I wanted you here, as the only person I personally know that I would say is a coyote expert. You and well, maybe Carly as well.
Oh,
possibly.
Sure, yeah.
I should have her on the show as well, actually. Mm-hmm. But yeah, so what have we learned about coyotes? Are we in a coyote apocalypse? Do people need to be worried about their children? What are they eating that is messing with their microbiome? There's so many topics. Yeah.
Well, I don't think there's going to be a coyote apocalypse. But if we really mess up the earth badly, we humans, and a lot of species disappear, which maybe is already underway, I think coyotes will be among the species that will do just fine because they're so adaptable and they're so good at being a step ahead of people. So they really figure out how to exploit us, and they do it just craftily enough that we can't seem to quite prevent them from doing that. There's a great book by Dan Flores called Coyote America.
Oh, I was going to mention that.
Yeah. He does a super job of just charting how unsuccessful the coyote eradication campaign that's been going on in rural areas across North America, how unsuccessful it's been at getting rid of coyotes, and in fact, how there just seems to be more and more and more coyotes. And one reason for that that he mentions, and others have described too in the peer-reviewed scientific literature, is that when coyotes or most species of carnivores are a bit like this, when they're persecuted, especially the social carnivores, wolves, coyotes, lions, they change their life history, just like we were talking about earlier with R and K selection. So they become more R selected. They breed at earlier ages for the first time, and they have larger litters, typically shorter lives, and maybe less duration of care for the young. So the young might be a little bit more prone to, just figuring things out for themselves in bold ways. So he speculates, and others have too, that some of the reason coyotes are moving into urban areas is this just relentless persecution surrounding urban areas. And then two things happen. There's these big litter size of this constantly increasing population of young, naive, sometimes desperate animals, and this refuge from being hunted in cities. So really in cities, the only source of mortality for coyotes is vehicle collisions, and occasionally, lethal control by wildlife managers. But that's not very popular with the public, so it's used really sparingly in the city and pretty much all cities across North America.
It depends who you're speaking to, because as the guy who had to listen to those complaints from the public for 4 years, there was a good mix of people, some of whom were like, kill every coyote you see, some of whom were never touch any wild animals ever, and then the sensible middle ground who was like, don't do it if you don't need to, but every once in a while you should get rid of a few.
Yeah. Yeah, that sensible middle ground is actually supported by the literature as well. This is work led by Stuart Breck, and he and his colleagues have shown that removing problem individuals from urban coyotes is really effective at almost immediately. You can see a change in the reports of conflict behavior by people. And that makes sense. If you've got some animals that have learned to associate people with food, for example, that's known as food conditioning, they become so brazen and really prone to conflict. So they become more and more of a threat to people and pets. And it's very hard to reverse food conditioning. Yeah. So when that happens, those animals, problem individuals, they pretty much have to be removed from the population, and it works. The conflict behavior associated with them disappears, unless a behavior by people like feeding coyotes continues, and then there's just another coyote that takes the place of that conflict individual. It develops the same food conditioned behavior, and then it needs to be removed as well. So really getting at the root of that problem requires a lot of public education and awareness of just how damaging it is in so many ways, but including to the coyotes. Yeah. To feed them intentionally.
So coyotes, they teach their offspring novel behaviors pretty quickly, right? That's one of the reasons why problem coyotes need to be removed quickly, because otherwise they're going to teach their offspring their novel problem behavior, and then they're going to teach their offspring.
Yeah, for sure. They are very social animals, and there's absolutely no question that they rely a lot on social learning. So the pups learn how to hunt from their parents. They learn how to go into neighborhoods and look for garbage from their parents. They learn how to trust people from their parents. So another study, this one led by Chris Schell, has shown that the pups of coyotes that are habituated are themselves even more habituated to people. Oh. So once more, kind of a demonstration of how you really need to nip these problems in the bud if you want to have coexistence with urban coyotes.
Yeah, the urban versus rural coyote discussion, that was something I had to speak with a lot of people about, because they would say, out on my family's farm, the coyotes wouldn't let you get within like a kilometer of them, but here they'll go 10 meters away. And I would have to explain to them, yeah, they have been adapting to humans for the last century in Edmonton. I don't even know. This brings me to another thing I was wondering. Are there any noticeable cultural differences between coyotes in, say, Alberta versus Manitoba versus the eastern United States? Are there noticeable behavioral differences between geographic clusters? Is that something that's ever been looked at?
Well, excuse me, there's a couple answers to that question. There are differences between eastern and western coyotes. Genetic studies have shown that eastern coyotes hybridized with wolves as wolves were being extirpated, made extinct in that area. And coyotes were invading, because historically coyotes occurred in this sort of, most historically probably in the southwest arid part of the United States. Mm-hmm. Think of Wile E. Coyote in the cartoon and that kind of environment. And they have probably had a range expansion going on for hundreds of years, but so too have they had this relationship with people. So coyotes they feature really prominently in native lore throughout North America, and different First Nations have different stories about coyotes, but something they all seem to share is an appreciation of how clever coyotes are, and they're known often as the trickster. So as these tricksters hybridized with wolves, it seems that they became larger and perhaps also more aggressive, more capable of taking down large prey, for example. So you might remember that terrible situation that occurred in Cape Breton National Park, where a young lady was killed by a group of coyotes. And
that was the first coyote fatality in well, I think in human history, there have been 2 recorded coyote fatalities.
That I don't know.
It was something very little, but that was the only one in Canada so far.
Yeah, it's the only one I know of, in fact. And especially an attack on an adult is of anywhere near that severity is pretty rare. So adults have been bitten by coyotes lots of times, but the injuries aren't usually severe. They can be quite severe for children, though. So those coyotes in Cape Breton were known to be eating moose, and that's a pretty unusual food for coyotes if you consider these, 500-pound moose being taken down by these 40-pound coyotes. That's really exceptional boldness. But similar things occur in Africa with packs of hyenas or wild dogs, although wild dogs are quite a bit bigger than coyotes. So back to those behavioral differences, there's that kind of difference, east-west, but then there's also really striking what you could call personality differences among coyotes. We've studied this a little bit, but the best published study is another one by Stuart Breck and his group in Colorado. And they developed a really simple test. They put kind of a scent lure in the middle of this square that they surrounded with rope and flagging. And the coyotes, they monitored this with remote cameras, and the coyotes just had to go, pass by this rope with flag to just sort of emulates the ancient technique of fladry, which most mammals are kind of mistrustful of. So they had to overcome that fear.
Sorry to interrupt, but the term fladry, just for anyone that doesn't know, that's just a piece of fabric flapping in the wind.
Yeah,
correct?
Exactly. So typically today people use flagging tape, but it's a centuries-old technique that's been used to protect livestock from wolves, for example. It doesn't work forever, but it works for quite a while. It definitely makes them more wary.
Interesting.
So the coyotes had to overcome this sort of string effect and check out this lure. And what Stuart and his colleagues showed is that the urban coyotes were quite a bit bolder about that than the rural coyotes. And that's not surprising because they've been habituating for decades, as you pointed out. But even within one individual, it's pretty clear that coyotes are a species that have tremendous behavioral flexibility. So one of the things I'd love to study in them is this phenomenon of reversal learning. So that refers to something that an animal has learned, or a human as well, and then has to unlearn to, benefit from a new set of circumstances. And reversal learning is really hard because it requires that the brain sort of unlearn an association it's already made that might be, say, negative, and learn a new association that's positive and kind of erase that old lesson. So to explain that a bit, I'll describe an experiment that I dreamed up one time, and I haven't done it on coyotes because it turned out to be logistically a little too elaborate, but it worked like this, and I did try it on my own cat and dog. So it was an automated pet feeder in the middle of a little kind of corridor. And on either end was an electric pet mat, the sort that you use to train your pet not to jump up on the couch, let's say. So I turned on first, let's call it side A of the pet mat, and taught the dog and cat that they could get at the pet feeder if they went in to side B, and periodically the pet feeder was renewed, so they were motivated to go in repeatedly. And then I turned off side A and I turned on side B, and they had to learn side B was no longer safe, but side A was. And the cat figured it out quite quickly after getting this mild shock a couple of times, So curiosity kills the cat. I think that's an apt expression. And it quickly figured out the pet feeder was still accessible from side A and then went in and got the food. But the dog just laid on the floor inside of the formerly safe side B and whined at the pet feeder. She couldn't learn. She couldn't unlearn that side B was no longer safe and side A was no longer unsafe. So coyotes are super good at that kind of learning. And I think one of the things that demonstrates that is that all domestic dogs are descended from wolves. Every size, from Chihuahua to Great Dane, all over the world, they're all descended from wolves. And coyotes have never been domesticated by people, even though they've got these ancient histories of living with people. They've been living with people and among people for thousands of years. That's clear.
Yeah.
and they just keep outsmarting us.
There was a book, I should have picked it up. It was a story of some woman in, I believe it was Colorado, who was essentially left with this coyote puppy, and she had to raise the thing. If I find it, I will definitely pick it up for you. Have you read this book already?
No, I haven't heard of it.
It was like you know what? I'm going to look up that name and I'll throw the picture of the book into the video. But yeah, like the cover of the book, it's just this coyote with a collar on, which is so strange to see. I know that we've been seeing a lot of people domesticating foxes recently. That's become a big thing.
Yeah, they are quite domesticable, if that's a word.
Because they started doing it pretty intensely a few decades back, and now we have foxes that are just completely habituated and friendly, and I'm trying to remember what the term is, neotenous, where they have like their eyes are slightly bigger, their ears are starting to fold a bit more. They have all the traits that humans think are cutesy.
Yeah. Very interesting.
And they think that's connected with the domestication process.
That's interesting. I've heard that of dogs. Neoteny refers to the neonatal state. And I've heard that humans have been selecting for dogs that look more neonatal for probably centuries. I think maybe the most effective example would be the King Charles Spaniel, if you've ever seen those
my
guys.
friend has two.
Massive eyes.
Yeah.
Yeah, and it's really kind of messed them up, so they're prone to all kinds of problems. And the sort of scrunched in faces of bulldogs and pit bulls and so on might be another example, especially bulldogs. The Canadian Veterinary Association actually discourages people from buying those dogs because they suffer so much from the consequences of not having enough room for their nasal passages.
I think I'm starting to see some glimmers of hope, though, because for a lot of, like, as someone who's still looking to get myself a dog, I'm seeing a lot of discussions between show breeds versus working breeds for dogs. And it seems like a lot of people are selecting more for the working breeds. Like, a good example are German Shepherds. Like show shepherds, they all have that sloped back where like the butt kind of tucks in. But then you look at the working shepherds and they all have a much flatter back, and they don't have the same number of like genetic issues because they are bred to actually be healthy so they can work for you. Like you look at a lot of the police dogs and a lot of hunting dogs. When you're going for a working breed, you don't care if it's pretty. You care if it can be healthy and get the job done. Yeah,
that's interesting, Gareth. It sort of ties in with something that I've noticed about tracking coyotes, which is that, coyote and dog tracks look fairly similar, but one of the things you look for to distinguish them is the sort of tightness of the toe pads. And my student, Sage Raymond, has explained that's because dogs have very flaccid muscles in their toes because they don't exercise much. So their toes are really spread out. But I noticed even before knowing Sage that the kind of dog that leaves a print that looks very much like a coyote is a border collie, a working dog.
Interesting.
With presumably much tighter toe pad muscles.
Here's a picture that kind of showcases the dramatic difference between the arch of the back. The show dogs, they all have that sloped back because for some reason a long time ago people thought that looked more shepherdy. Whereas the working dog, you can see it still has the slight slope. Yeah. But it's much flatter. It doesn't have like the tail tuck back as much.
Yeah. And shorter legs too in the show dog.
Yeah. So it does make me happy seeing that more people are starting to lean towards the working lines, because that does make for a much healthier dog. Just a whole bunch of pictures of the show dog versus the working dog. Yeah.
I guess the challenge would be providing enough work for the working dog, because I understand from friends who have them that they become very unhappy dogs if they are just, locked up in the house all day.
Yeah, don't get a German Shepherd if you don't have a lot of time and energy, because I've known some people that have had German Shepherds and they didn't give them the time and energy they needed. And then they weren't properly socialized. They would be a little self-destructive. They would, do things like eat walls and couches, and because they just needed to get the energy out somehow. Yeah. If you're just a normal person that doesn't have a ton of time, get something like, I don't know, a Pekingese or something small or lazy. I've heard Mastiffs are surprisingly good house dogs because they're big and they get tired quickly. So you'd have to pay a lot of money for food, and you'd have to clean up really big poops, but they don't require that much physical stimulation.
Oh, interesting.
A lot of mastiffs are just so heavy.
Yeah.
That, you take them out to the dog park for, 15, 20 minutes and they're done.
Yeah.
They're
overheating.
done. Yeah. Now, I know you briefly touched on it earlier and we kind of got sidetracked, but you've done a lot of work as well regarding the microbiome of a coyote's gut.
Yeah.
And I know, I'm not going to butcher your study, but could you speak a bit about some of the things you found going on in the guts of urban coyotes?
Yeah, sure. Well, I'll go back a few years and say first that the first student in my lab that studied coyote diet by looking at scat samples was Maureen Murray, and she showed that urban coyotes have a much more anthropogenic, meaning human origin, diet. So they eat more, garbage, but also more of things like domestic fruit, apples in particular, and more compost. And we also noticed that the coyotes that we radio-collared that had mange, which is a skin parasite, we, with our first 4 coyotes, there was sort of this 2-by-2 split. The coyotes we caught near compost had mange and the ones we did not. And that's when we began suspecting there was something interesting about compost. So we've been chasing that for many years now, and what we showed later, still more work of Maureen's, is that the compost contains stuff that's really bad for coyotes, mycotoxins. So that's just fungal pee and poop, if you will, the metabolites of fungus. So when you see stuff growing on your leftovers, not to eat it. But even before you can see it, there is stuff growing on your leftovers in the fridge. Hence the Canada food guides of, don't eat fish, say, more than a day after you cook it. So these mycotoxins.
That short?
That is the Canada food guide. My husband reminds me regularly for fish, because I really don't like throwing out leftovers. But I have become a reformed leftover hoarder, I guess. I no longer hoard leftovers because of this study. So what Maureen showed with work by an undergrad named Jesse Hill is that compost is full of these mycotoxins at quite high levels. And so we took core samples from a bunch of compost sources that we knew coyotes were eating, and a bunch of sources of natural foods that we found in the river valley, like berries, for example. And there was much more mycotoxins in these compost samples. And also the scats left by coyotes in those locations were much more full of tapeworm eggs, 10 times the density of tapeworm eggs in those. So putting those together and using the literature, we speculated that was actually degrading their immune system to eat that kind of crappy food. And then years later, we returned to this issue to get at the microbiome question you just asked about. And we did it with carcasses of coyotes that were donated to us by people that were trapping coyotes for other reasons. And some of those animals were removed for lethal management because they were in conflict, for example.
Yeah.
And what we found in those coyotes is, again, this distinction between the urban and rural animals. The urban animals ate more anthropogenic things. So this time we were able to study that in 2 ways. We did it with stable isotopes, which is a technique that just looks at the isotopes of carbon and nitrogen to determine how much anthropogenic food of a processed sort is in the diet. That's because it detects what are known as C4 plants, like corn, that don't grow here naturally. So if there's corn in the diet of an animal, you know that it's been eating processed human food where corn is a really common component. And it takes lots of forms. So it might not be called corn on the label. It might be called maltodextrose or something.
Yeah.
So we found for sure, as Maureen had, that those urban coyotes were eating more processed food. But we also found, then going on to some of the details of what we found in stomachs is that their stomachs were just incredibly diverse in what they contained. So the rural coyotes were eating more prey generally, except the urban coyotes were eating more like small prey, rodents. And I'll come back to that in a moment of why that's important. The urban coyotes were eating a lot more anthropogenic types of food, but it also seemed that urban coyotes were sort of specializing on different kinds of food that were unlike the composition of food for the rural coyotes. So Scott Sugden, who showed that the urban coyotes had mixtures of microbiomes that were quite unlike the rural coyotes, but they weren't particularly like each other. So it's not like the whole microbiome community, the microbes living in the gut, shifted in a predictable direction for the urban versus the rural coyotes. There were a couple of differences, but mostly the urban coyotes just had, if you think of kind of a target with a bullseye in the middle being maybe a healthy, natural coyote microbiome, the rural coyotes were clustered around that center area, and the urban coyotes were sort of spread out on all sides of it. So microbiologists actually have a name for this phenomenon of microbiomes. They call it the Anna Karenina effect. And I haven't read this book, but apparently Tolstoy's book, Anna Karenina, I hope I'm saying that right, it has an opening line that happy families are all alike and unhappy families are each unhappy in their own way. So the urban coyote microbiomes are each like unhealthy in their own way. And it could be because of what we were talking about earlier, this tremendous behavioral flexibility that coyotes have. So they end up sort of specializing on odd sources of food, like compost. And they, if they find that they can succeed in getting enough calories that way, they might kind of return to that. And they're very opportunistic. So another thing that we've found with coyotes, just as an aside, this is work with Nick Nation, who's a veterinary pathologist, is that sometimes people bring cats, dead cats, into wildlife officials or the city police saying, like, look at this cat or this half a cat, and look at these scalpel-like cuts. This has to be the work of a cult.
Satanists.
Yeah. So poor Nick necropsied all these cats and then showed me a bunch of pictures, and we puzzled over them, and we determined that, yes, in every case, these 53 cat carcasses could be attributed to coyote predation or scavenging. And the reason they occurred in these sort of clusters of events was exactly this phenomenon that coyotes would learn, for example, to specialize on cats. So that's sort of a long way of answering your question about the microbiome. There are some sort of directional differences in it. One of them is the urban coyotes had less fusobacteria generally in their guts.
What type of bacteria is that?
It's fusobacteria. That's one that's associated with protein in the diet. So the urban coyotes were eating less protein, the same thing we'd found with the stable isotopes, in this case, isotopes of nitrogen. But I'm mentioning that one in particular because it's an example of this kind of extreme disruption that can happen in the microbiome. So the next thing I'll tell you is an anecdote, whereas Scott's work and Maureen's work was, those generalizations were the consequences of hundreds of individual coyotes. But this one is an anecdote just describing one coyote. And the one coyote I'm going to tell you about is one that was in the news a few years ago in Edmonton, because it apparently killed a huge dog, a Bernese mountain dog.
Oh, yes, this story.
Remember that one?
Yeah.
Yeah, 2018.
McKinnon Ravine or Mackenzie Ravine?
Mackenzie, yeah. So what seems to have happened when we went and looked at the site where this dog was killed is the coyote pinned the dog to the ground. This was an off-leash dog, only about 50 meters from the back door of somebody's house. Maybe less than that, 30 meters perhaps. And the coyote had been seen on video camera, like security camera footage, sort of seeming to play with this dog just days before. But it was approaching breeding season. Probably that coyote felt very territorial. And when it killed this dog, it pinned it to the ground, seems to have bitten it in the neck. The dog bled out in just one deep blood hole. So that's pretty amazing that this maximum 40-pound coyote pinned this 110-pound dog to the ground,
Yeah.
bit it, and held it there until it died.
Yeah.
That's amazing, isn't it? So that's very worrisome behavior that close to a house. And so the animal damage control folks were hired by the city to go in and find and kill that coyote. And we received the carcass. And, assuming they got the right animal, which I think is pretty likely, it was a big male. Looked like it was in great health, but it had no fusobacteria in its gut, none. And that's amazing because it was the only coyote in our sample of 120 animals with no fusobacteria. But what's really interesting about it is that in studies of dogs, the absence of fusobacteria from dogs that are eating very high carbohydrate diets is associated with really high rates of aggression.
Oh.
So we put this together. The reason we're really curious about the microbiome is because it might be kind of like a canary in the coal mine. It's an easy thing to monitor. Well, it's not easy for me. I don't have the lab skills. But for the people with the know, you can monitor it from, we used poop samples from just inside the rectum. So not so different from the poop samples that could be collected from the ground.
Yeah.
And that could tell you about the kind of diet these animals have, and it could feed into, so to speak, public education campaigns if, for example, intentional feeding of coyotes is suspected, as it turns out is suspected in this particular area. Mm-hmm. So that coyote might have been eating a lot of provided food that was high in carbohydrates. And something I've noticed with many dogs is that they're crazy over bread. And it seems that's true of coyotes too. So it's another anecdote that Sage Raymond found, but she found once or maybe more than once in the stashes of food left by people experiencing homelessness that coyotes then ate. They didn't go for, the package of fish or meat. They went for the bread.
Interesting.
Yeah. But it's not so hard to understand because those very high carb things are known, very high glycemic indices. They interact with the opioid centers in the brain. So that's what makes carbs so addictive. And dairy products are similar.
I don't think I knew that bread affected my opioid receptors. Oh my God.
Yes. Well, you might have noticed that you just have trouble like stopping with one piece of garlic toast.
Do the French know about this?
Well, yes, the French, they're terrible inconvenience for the hypothesis about how bad for you bread is.
Yeah.
But there is speculation, this is way outside of my expertise, so now I'm just totally pop culturing it here, but there is speculation that the breeding of wheat over the last few centuries differs in North America and Europe. So there might be some variation that way. Also, the French always eat their bread with cheese, a high protein, but albeit dairy thing, and high rate of smoking, appetite suppressant, and generally Mediterranean diet with all kinds of antioxidant protective things. So who knows? It's a big mess. If I've learned one thing as an ecologist, it's that everything is contingent on other things, and it's really hard to get just a pure signal of the effect of A on B.
Isn't it funny how the more you learn, the less you know?
Oh, yes. That's very true. Coyotes have certainly taught me that.
In fact, going back to the scat samples as well, you were the first person who brought the term, now I'm forgetting the name, Echinococcus multilocularis. You were the first person to bring that to my attention. Now, if I remember, it started off as a normal tapeworm over in Europe and then somehow mutated when it got to North America to become more virulent?
Yeah, that's quite close. I'm not an Echinococcus expert, but what I've learned from people who are, and maybe added to a little bit with our studies, is what I'll tell you next. So it is a tapeworm that's found around the world. It's circumpolar in its distribution. And it occurs as different strains. They're not different species. It's Euchinococcus multilocularis in Europe and in North America. And it's been here in North America for a long time. And when a colleague in Calgary, Alessandro Massolo is his name, now at the University of Pisa, started studying this parasite, I can recall some of the senior parasitologists saying, yeah, I don't know why you're bothering with this. It's been here forever. It's really not a problem for wildlife or people. Although there were some cases, I think from like northern Russia or something of it being a problem for people. But anyway, he started studying it. And what Ali has worked out over the years is that a strain has arrived from Europe fairly recently. It probably came with dogs, and which readily get this parasite that is transmitted between canids, the dog family, and small rodents. So it probably came with dogs, and it seems that this European strain has now mutated since it arrived in North America to a strain that's unique to North America, but most closely related to the European strain. And it's a much bigger deal in Europe. It kills thousands of people, it's estimated anyway, in places like Mongolia, where there might be, less opportunity for good food hygiene and so on.
Wait, I heard it was in like marmots over in Mongolia, something like that.
I hadn't heard that, but it is.
Or is that where they got the plague? There was something involving Mongolian people eating, I believe it was marmots, and they got bubonic plague. Let's see. Google. Teenage boy dies of bubonic plague in Mongolia after eating an infected marmot. Okay, thank God. We don't have to edit this part out. It was real.
It's real. That's an incredible memory. Well, that's interesting. I didn't think you could get plague from eating. Oh, yeah, I guess you could. Bacterium. Well, geez, there's so many things to worry about. So Echinococcus is a problem there, also through sort of the Middle East. So Ali has a colleague in Iran who never eats strawberries because all those little indentations on strawberries are a perfect way to hide the microscopic eggs of this parasite.
Oh, God, no.
Sorry.
That's going to be in my head now.
Well, just wash them.
And just try not to visualize all the little seeds as tiny little eggs.
Yeah, don't do that. Strawberries are lovely. But Echinococcus is being surveyed now, censused fairly regularly in like the garden plots of France, where it has quite a high prevalence. So it does seem to be spreading. And what's really unique and concerning about it is that the Edmonton area, this part of Alberta, seems to be kind of an epicenter for this parasite appearing in people. There's now been 21 Albertans diagnosed.
Excuse, that number has gone up since we last spoke.
Yeah, unfortunately it has. Stan Houston is the one who's been leading this human effort, just recently retired from Alberta Health Services. And so Ali and Stan have worked together, and they've put out some alerts in the peer-reviewed medical literature, as well as just Alberta Health alerts about the need to be more aware of this parasite and the fact that it can persist in the environment as these sort of hardened eggs for if it's the same as has been measured in Europe for over a year. So how this parasite works, its life cycle, is that it infects rodents as an intermediate host, and when rodents eat these microscopic eggs when they're eating vegetation, so not intentionally, it's just the eggs are on the vegetation they're eating, and then they consume it. And then these cysts develop starting in their livers, but then growing to impact their whole internal body cavity, kind of a grotesque way, and it makes them much less able to avoid predators, so they're more likely to be eaten by predators. A very clever strategy by the parasite. And then the coyotes or foxes or dogs are infected as the definitive host of this parasite, and then they make more little proglottids or worms that can be shed in their feces as eggs that can then be consumed by a new set of rodents. So humans would become infected by accidentally ingesting these tiny microscopic eggs, and that could happen For example, if you were, and now these are the contexts that Sage is studying, the one who's the expert tracker. So she's just collected some scat samples from coyotes from community gardens. That would be one place where people maybe are a little under-aware. Community gardens that are not fenced, especially if they're occurring in areas with lots of coyotes, as they are over on the south campus of the University Farm.
Or the Strathcona Rail Garden.
Yeah, that's one we've sampled, the Strathcona Rail Garden. Or another context would be what we've called the ecotone. That just means a division between habitat types, between houses that back on ravines and natural areas. So Edmonton has all these ravines, as you know, and in some neighborhoods, the houses that back on these ravines have a very low fence or even no fence. So Sage censused a bunch of these ravines and studied how coyotes seem to be coming and going between them. And I don't want to say too much more about this. This paper is in review and it's Sage's story to tell. But the relevant part for this story is that's another place where people might be kind of underestimating their exposure to this parasite, especially if they're feeding wildlife. And they might not be targeting coyotes, but if they're feeding birds and bird seeds falling on the ground, they are also feeding coyotes. Actually, Sage found bird seed in a third of the coyote scats that she detected at this ecotone.
Yeah.
So that would be another place. People that are experiencing homelessness would be another group that might be vulnerable. You can imagine that if you're living rough in the river valley and you have no access to washing facilities and you're sleeping on the ground and eating out there, that would be another place you could encounter these microscopic eggs, especially since coyotes do seem to be attracted to encampments. They probably get food at those locations.
Out of the 21 confirmed cases of human echinococcus, do we know how many were homeless?
None that I know of, Gareth, but the best predictor, this is work by the provincial provincial kind of zoonotic disease lab.
The one with Margot?
This one is with Kinga Kowalska-Grochowska. I think I said that right.
Okay.
She's a medical parasitologist in that unit, and she has said that the best predictor of what is associated with the 21 Albertans that have been infected with this parasite is association with dogs. And so that could happen a couple of ways. If your dog is infected, as if it's a coyote, those eggs would be shed with the dog's feces. So even if you're, pretty tidy with dog feces, you're picking them up in your yard. But then maybe another time you're, rolling around on the grass in your yard. I mean, I do that with playing with your dog or kids, or you're just sitting on the ground while you're weeding or whatever, and then you have a sandwich. Like, it would just be easy, I think. But the other way that dogs could infect people, I think, would be if the dogs are attracted to... So I better back up. The eggs would be in the dog feces if the dog is a rodent eater. Some dogs are.
Oh, okay.
And it ate an infected rodent. The eggs would be in the dog's liver if it ate grass where the eggs were found. The parasite would treat it as an accidental intermediate host, and it would suffer the same kind of consequences as a rodent. And that was actually the first detection in Canada, a dog in, I think, Kelowna in 2009, that was serving as an intermediate host. But one more way that dogs could infect, so nobody's going to eat their dog's liver, right? People aren't going to get infected that way.
Yeah.
But one more way that dogs could infect people would be if dogs are rolling in the scat of coyotes. Lots of dogs do that.
Oh.
And then the dog is, back in your home and it's sitting with you on the couch and you're petting it and you're eating popcorn, or your dog's lays on the bed or whatever. Again, it would be easy. Luckily, Emily Jenkins, who's a professor at the vet college in Saskatchewan, says you wouldn't expect a human to be infected by eating one or a couple of these eggs. You'd have to sort of eat them repeatedly. And
You would hope.
Yeah. This is her assertion, and I sure hope she's right.
Yeah, same.
So you would have to have some sort of circumstance where your dog is constantly exposing you to these eggs. And as awareness grows, I think that will become less and less, common. So anybody with a cat allergy always washes their hands after they pet their cat. The same precaution might be warranted for dogs. And keep the dog off the couch, off the bed.
So a good way to protect yourself is just a lot of basic sanitation stuff. Wash your hands when you touch your dog. Wash your fruit and vegetables.
Yep.
Wash your hands right before you eat every time.
Yep. Yeah. And, just sort of build awareness. Don't attract wildlife into your yard. And that's maybe tip number one for urban wildlife and zoonotic diseases, not just this one. Like raccoons are, I think, in the process of establishing in Edmonton. They seem to be sighted more and more often around the outskirts of Edmonton, even within the city.
We're starting to hear more of it.
Yeah, one was seen not far from the university. That's pretty central.
I think one of the animal damage control guys actually mentioned that a raccoon messed with one of their coyote traps.
Oh, interesting. Huh. I wonder how they detected that. Well, raccoons have a roundworm that is really scary. It can cause, fatal brain infection in people. So,
oh my God.
No matter what the wildlife is, but even deer, people are still attracting deer intentionally into their yards as if they haven't heard of Lyme disease, which is definitely in Alberta now. And so you just don't want to be doing that. You don't want to be attracting wildlife into your yard, whether it's jackrabbits, one of the favorite prey of coyotes, or geese eating on the ground. Bread on the ground for geese is going to attract coyotes for sure, as I've explained. Even feeding birds in a suspended bird feeder, if you're doing that with a feeder that attracts sparrows, they're so messy, they throw that seed all over the place. It's on the ground attracting rodents and coyotes. And you're quite literally setting up the perfect circumstances for Echinococcus to increase. And then one thing I didn't mention about Scott's study is that he found about a 50% higher prevalence of this parasite in coyotes in Edmonton than in rural coyotes surrounding Edmonton. So that could have to do with their diet, higher in rodents, or maybe a higher prevalence of rodents that are infected, or their immune system, because there's some evidence in other species, dogs and foxes, that older animals acquire immunity to this parasite over their lives that maybe urban coyotes are not acquiring. So it's kind of an exciting era of research on these topics. I think you can see they're all kind of intertwined. This problem of feeding wildlife that seems to be growing in cities because more and more people lack any experience with wildlife. They think of them as cute and they want to help them. And
I think that ties in with the loneliness epidemic as well. There are so many people in Edmonton who have nobody, like especially as people get older, you stop making new friends, maybe your family moves on or you've alienated yourself.
Yeah.
And all you have is your perceived connection with wildlife.
Yeah, that's so well put, Gareth. Yeah, I do think that that's true, that the pandemic is well established right now, that it's caused this massive uptick in mental health problems for people, and humans have a deep need to be needed.
Yeah. And like that desire for a connection with anything, but especially nature. Like, without giving away any details that could get me in trouble, one of the people who I dealt with who was feeding wildlife was an older woman who claimed to have a sort of agreement with the coyotes. Probably not the one you're thinking of. It's one that I don't think you and I have discussed personally yet. I'll tell you off air more details. But this person claimed that she saw a wounded coyote once near a rec center. She picked the coyote up, slung it over her shoulders, took it back to her house, bandaged its paw, and took the glass out that was stuck in the paw pad. And the next time she saw the pack of coyotes, they, finger quotes hard, bowed to her. And since then, she had been feeding the coyotes multiple times a week because she thought in her mind they had developed some kind of collaborative relationship.
Oh boy. Well, that's somewhat delusional, but not unlike the stuff you find all over the internet. And I think that's a big contributor to the rise in feeding as well. There's quite a famous one of a fellow feeding raccoons.
I was going to bring it up, the hot dogs.
The profile, yeah. And so when I talk to people about this, I try to do it in a way that kind of honors and appreciates that human compassion, because that's such a beautiful emotion, that capacity for compassion. But then to sort of redirect it in a way that's more genuinely helpful, like protect natural habitat, or pick up litter, or prevent people from feeding wildlife because of all the problems it causes for people, increasing the likelihood of lethal management for coyotes, for example, but also the problems it causes the wildlife. So, maybe one of the best examples is people feeding bread to birds, waterfowl in particular, and Canada geese especially. People just have a hard time stopping doing that. It's so fun. And it is how a lot of people feel about it. But it's also so well known that it causes terrible problems for them digestively and ultimately prevents them from flying. So it makes them totally dependent, with this phenomenon of angel wing.
That is something I didn't know until I started my park ranger job.
Ah, interesting. Yeah.
Because it's caused by the high carb diet, not enough protein, so the feathers don't develop properly.
That's right. The bones don't develop properly, and they develop this sort of deformation of their wings and can't fly, and then become utterly dependent on being on relying on human sources of food, whether it's direct feeding like breadcrumbs or just mowed grass, which are attracting geese everywhere. Now that we have avian flu increasing in virulence and prevalence, that's an even bigger problem, because Canada geese seem to be one of the species that's really prone to it. And everything that eats Canada geese, that scavenges on those carcasses, also prone to it. So this big outbreak of avian flu in skunks in Alberta. So once again, it's a very interesting time.
It's making the cross species jump,
yeah,
which none of us want.
No, like if avian flu makes the jump into people, we're in big trouble. And, it's well established that the increased virulence in avian flu is associated, and every outbreak has been associated with commercial poultry operations. And that's the density of birds that just is... the density and duration of birds, it's just utterly unnatural. Nothing like that happens under natural circumstances.
Yeah. Unreal. Well, it's been a bit over an hour. I don't want you to be late for your next meeting. Yes, I in fact am in some danger of that, so I should skedaddle, but that was fun. Is there anywhere people should look for your research online? Anything you want to share?
Well, we didn't actually talk a lot about the work we've done in the Edmonton Urban Coyote Project, so if people are interested in that, they could just type that into their web browser, Edmonton Urban Coyote Project, and our work would come up. We've been doing that collaboratively with you and other rangers at the city, Gareth, and with the folks at Animal Damage Control for, 14 years now. And it's been wonderful to have that collaboration. I think it's strengthened our work so much, and it's really helped the students who are have this privilege of studying some real things with others. So, yeah, thank you for your part in that, and thanks for inviting me today.
Thank you so much. Adios, folks.